My guest at this time is Joel Griffith. He's a research fellow in financial regulation at the Heritage Foundation. We want to get his reaction to February's surprisingly good jobs report and find out exactly what's driving that job growth. We'll also get his insights into the economic impact of the coronavirus concerns. And Joel, thanks very much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
A booming February jobs report. The expectation was 175,000. The reality was almost 100,000 more than that. Officially 273,000 jobs created in the month of February, and earlier months revised much higher. Overall unemployment rate down to 3.5% again. What's responsible for that?
Well, I think that we're seeing continued positive results from the last 3 years of rolling back regulations and making our tax system more competitive. I think most of us have realized extra benefits in our paychecks because of the tax cuts, but more importantly, our business tax code is far more competitive. We had some of the highest business taxes in the world. The tax cuts from 2+ years ago now have made us roughly about the average that we've seen in the industrialized world, and that's going to produce long-term economic growth, and we're seeing the continued results of that.
Give us a little more detail on that if you can, Joel. Obviously, the tax cuts were a little more than 2 years ago now, and regulations have been rolling back for more than 3 years now. But exactly how is that impacting business decisions? They're clearly hiring. We're seeing that. But what about expansion and other areas? How is there a tangible impact on these businesses from these different policies?
We're seeing hirings, we're seeing expansions, we're seeing investment, and I think we really need to look at, too, is the productivity. It's productivity that allows all of us to actually receive a better standard of living, right? The more that you can produce with the inputs that you have. And the numbers that just also recently came out the last 2 weeks show that we now are having the fastest growth in productivity, the biggest gains that we've seen now in about a decade. That's big. That allows us to see more pay without seeing that inflation. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing median household income at an all-time high adjusted for inflation. And we're seeing unemployment near a record low historically. And for some groups, we are at record lows for unemployment.
It's hard to argue with those statistics. The president outlined a lot of them in the State of the Union address. Joel, there were a lot of economists, I believe, heading from 2018 into 2019 who were pretty confident that we were headed towards at least a mild recession. Obviously, we're not there. What did they get wrong?
Well, I think that a lot of people presume that the economic cycles that we see, boom, slowdown, recession, then growth, that's just part of economic nature. But it's not. There's nothing built into the laws of nature, into the laws of economics that say that we have to have a recession follow after a certain length of time. Now, we've seen the longest stretch of economic growth, uninterrupted growth that we've seen in our lifetime, since before World War II. So this is an incredible stretch. But having that stretch, having that series of monthly wins does not mean that we need to go ahead and expect a recession next quarter. Typically, what we see are that recessions are actually caused usually by humankind, by policies that the government gets wrong. Sometimes by trying to juice the economy, sometimes by trying to manipulate it, sometimes by war. That's usually what pushes us into recession. Very rarely does it just happen naturally or because of some catastrophe within Mother Nature.
We're talking with Joel Griffith of the Heritage Foundation. And, Joel, we've already seen coronavirus concerns wreak havoc on the markets. The past 2 weeks have been a roller coaster when it comes to the rise and fall of the Dow Jones and the other indexes as well. So there's plenty of worry about disrupted supply chains and how we might be running low on certain critical items made in places like China. What impact is all this having on our economy right now, and what's your expectation over the coming weeks and months here?
Well, for anyone who's following the markets or following retirement accounts, we're definitely seeing that impact within the stock market. We're in a correction phase now. We've declined more than 10% from the all-time highs that we recently set, and we've seen major volatility. I mean, this week alone, we had 2 days that were up at over 1,000 points, which are more than we've ever seen in a given day. Twice that happened this week. But then we had several days like today where we were way down. So there's a lot of fear, not just with typical workers, but there's a lot of fear with the investor class as well, and that's because there's a lot of unknowns with this. We have a lot of numbers coming in as far as what mortality rates are, and I think some of those numbers are actually beginning to put some minds at ease as far as your chance of dying if you get the virus. But what we've seen, though, in China is you've seen widespread shutdowns. With the government quarantining cities, there's some of these provinces that have populations that exceed that of our state of California, and those factories for a time went nearly completely offline. And that doesn't just impact China, that impacts us because we have an interconnected global economy. We rely on a lot of those inputs from those factories, not just for our consumer purchases when we go to Walmart or go to Target, but a lot of those inputs are actually used in manufacturing other products. They're intermediate goods. And we can't easily shift sourcing those supplies to other countries or bringing those back home. So globalism has been that global economy has been a net benefit for all of us because we've been able to produce more with limited resources. But in times like this, it does give us some economic hurdles, and this is something that we haven't quite dealt with before on this level. So it's giving some consternation to stock market investors.
What sort of policies, if any, do you think could be prudent to pursue here just to brace for whatever the worst of the coronavirus is?
Well, I think number one is full transparency. We've seen our government doing a far, far better job than what China did initially. If you read through some of the reports of how the Chinese government was reacting to this, the hiding what was actually going on, not being fully transparent with the public, not issuing proper precautions early on, unfortunately, that exacerbated this problem. And we've seen our government respond by providing updated numbers, by coordinating with state and local governments and health providers. So that's all good. But the other component of this is we need to be careful not to act irrationally in response to this, not to panic needlessly, and for the government and also for media not to sensationalize this, because regardless of whether or not or to what extent this virus is a threat to you and to me, if people overreact and take needless precautions, then regardless of whether or not that threat is real, that will suppress economic growth. So we need to be careful with that. We need to keep these numbers in perspective. There has been tragic loss of life, and of course, those that are suffering through this, our hearts go out to them. But we need to also remember that the daily deaths peaked from this last month at about 160 daily across the globe. That is horrible. We also need to keep in mind that during flu season here, in a bad season, we see that number of deaths each and every day in the United States. And, of course, we can and should take precautions against that as well. But we need to keep those numbers in mind and remember that the predominance of a story in the news cycle, particularly on tragedies such as this, that can alter our perception beyond that what the data show. So we need to keep the data in mind. Let's not sensationalize this. At the same time, take basic precautions. And for those that are in the higher risk categories, those that are elderly or have immune systems that are compromised, just as you're more susceptible towards other viruses, those are the folks that are most at risk from this, and we hope that everyone takes those proper precautions, especially in the at-risk categories.
Joel, earlier this week, we saw the Federal Reserve lower interest rates at a time that it was not scheduled to do so. Investors did not respond well to that, perhaps because they believed the Fed's action indicated that there ought to be greater concern about coronavirus than there already was. So what's your analysis of what the Fed did this week?
Well, I think that there were some that read into that because this was the first time the Fed jumped in and lowered the rates of the pay on reserves. First time they did that outside of a regular scheduled meeting since the financial crisis of a decade ago. So, look, the Fed is supposed to be there in order to provide liquidity in the credit marketplace if it freezes up. That's what they're supposed to be there for. To jump in and try to alter interest rates or to lower rates as they did, that's not going to have a real impact in our economy today. If people are deciding to stay home and not shop, or factories aren't producing, or people aren't traveling, lowering that rate by a quarter point or half a point or attempting to lower that rate, that's not going to actually remedy that situation. Now, if we end up with a credit shortage, if that actually happens and the markets begin to freeze up, that is a time for the Federal Reserve to step in. That's what they're there for. And thankfully, our federal government and the agencies, they do appear to be on top of this and ready to act if the need arises.
Joel, thank you so much for your insights. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.
You as well. Thank you.
Joel Griffith is a research fellow in financial regulation at the Heritage Foundation. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.